The sharp sound of ripping fabric cut through the office chatter. A cold, deafening silence followed. I stood there, exposed and humiliated. My manager's cruel smirk burning into my memory. He thought he was powerful, making an example of the poor intern in front of everyone. He saw my tears as a sign of his victory. What he didn't see were the polished black shoes stopping just outside the boardroom. He had no idea that in his attempt to shame me, he had just ended his own career, because the man he was about to meet was my husband. The stale, recycled air of the 47th floor at Apex Innovations always felt thin, like it was missing the essential component of oxygen that allowed for deep, calming breaths. For the past 6 months, I had learned to survive on shallow sips of it, just as I had learned to survive on the thin smiles and hollow pleasantries of my colleagues. My name is Alara, and I was the charity case intern, a title unofficially bestowed upon me by my manager, Mr. Sterling. I wasn't from a prestigious family, nor had I graduated from an Ivy League university. I had fought my way into this unpaid internship through sheer grit and a portfolio that screamed potential, or so I'd hoped. I wore simple, thrifted clothes, not out of a quirky fashion sense, but out of necessity. My husband, Liam, worked a remote data entry job that paid the bills for our tiny apartment, but left little for luxuries like designer work. He was my rock, my quiet supporter who listened to my daily struggles and always told me my worth wasn't defined by a price tag. Mr. Sterling, however, disagreed. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored suits. His cologne a noxious cloud that announced his arrival long before his condescending voice did. To him, my presence was an affront to the polished, wealthy image of Apex Innovations. He made his disdain clear in 1,000 small ways, forgetting to invite me to team lunches, accidentally spilling coffee near my desk, and referring to my carefully prepared reports as quaint little efforts. My colleagues, mostly ambitious young wolves, eager to climb the corporate ladder, took their cues from him. They treated me with a detached pity that was somehow worse than outright hostility. They would watch Sterling's daily microaggressions with the waiting for the final, bloody blow. That morning, the blow came. It was the day of the big quarterly review. The entire department was on edge, but the tension was electric for a different reason. The mysterious, unseen CEO of the parent company that had recently acquired Apex was rumored to be making his first appearance. The memo had been clear. Utmost professionalism is expected. I had spent the entire night perfecting my part of the presentation, a small but crucial data analysis. I was proud of it. I had even splurged on a new knee-length gray skirt from a second-hand shop. It was professional, modest, and made me feel, for a fleeting moment, like I belonged. The presentation was held in the main conference room, a glass-walled cage overlooking the sprawling city. Mr. Sterling was leading. He was slick, charming, and utterly brilliant at taking credit for other people's work. When my slide came up, he gestured for me to stand. And now, for a novel perspective, our intern, Alara, will walk us through the grassroots data, he announced, his tone dripping with condescension. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched my notes. I took a deep breath and began to speak. My voice was steadier than I expected. The data was solid, my conclusions sound. For a few minutes, I had their attention. I saw a few impressed nods from the senior partners. A flicker of pride ignited in my chest. It was that flicker that Sterling seemed determined to extinguish. "Thank you, Alara," he said, cutting me off just as I was about to deliver my final summary. A valiant effort, though perhaps a bit simplistic for our standards. He turned to the partners. "As you can see, the raw data lacks the nuance we cultivate here at Apex. It's a good starting point, but it needs a more refined hand." He was dismissing my work, my sleepless night, in front of everyone. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at my eyes. I sat down, my face burning. But he wasn't finished. He walked over to my chair, a cruel glint in his eyes. He leaned in, his voice a low, theatrical whisper meant for the whole room to hear. "You see, gentlemen, true quality is about more than just numbers. It's about presentation, polish. You can't put a cheap coat of paint on a broken-down car and call it a luxury vehicle." To illustrate his point, he reached down. I thought he was going to take my notes, to tear them up for dramatic effect, but his target was lower. His fingers brushed against the fabric of my new skirt. "Take this, for example," he said, his voice rising. "Material? It tries to look the part, but it lacks integrity." And then he pulled. The sharp, tearing sound of fabric ripping apart echoed in the suddenly silent room. It was a sound that would be seared into my memory forever. It was the sound of my dignity being I gasped, a strangled cry catching in my throat. I looked down. A long, jagged tear ran from the hem of my skirt all the way up my thigh, exposing my skin to the cold air and the colder stares of 20 pairs of eyes. The room was a sea of shocked faces, frozen in a tableau of disbelief and morbid fascination. Sterling stood over me, the torn piece of fabric still in his hand, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally broken the charity case. Tears welled, hot and unstoppable. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to cover the exposed skin, trying to shrink into nothingness. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. This was it, the final, bloody blow. I was a spectacle of shame. And then, the grand, double doors to the conference room swung open. A wave of fresh, clean air washed in, carrying with it an aura of absolute authority. Two figures stepped inside, but all eyes were drawn to the man in front. He was tall and moved, with an easy, confident grace that commanded attention without demanding it. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my apartment's annual rent. His face was calm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were scanning the room, taking in the scene with a sharp analytical intensity. A wave of whispers rippled through the room. It's him, the new CEO. Mr. Sterling's face transformed instantly. The cruel smirk vanished, replaced by a fawning, sycophantic grin. He dropped the piece of my skirt as if it were on fire and rushed forward, his hand outstretched. Sir, what an honor. We weren't expecting you for another hour. I'm Marcus Sterling, Senior Vice President. Welcome to Apex. The new CEO ignored Sterling's outstretched hand. His gaze continued to sweep the room until it landed on the scene in the corner. On Sterling, standing over me. On my torn skirt, on my tear-streaked face, and then his eyes met mine. The world stopped. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. The blood drained from my face, because I knew those eyes. I knew the gentle curve of that mouth, the small scar just above his left eyebrow. I had kissed that scar 1,000 times. The new CEO, the mysterious, powerful billionaire owner of the entire corporation, was Liam? My quiet, unassuming husband, who I thought was at home, plugging numbers into a spreadsheet. Liam's face remained impassive, but I saw a storm gather in the depths of his blue eyes, a cold, dangerous fury that I had never seen before. His gaze flickered from my face down to my ruined skirt, and then back up to a suddenly sweating Marcus Sterling. Mr. Sterling, Liam said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. Every person in the room, including the senior partners, seemed to shrink back. Why yes, sir, Sterling stammered, his sycophantic smile faltering. What is happening here? Liam asked, his eyes never leaving Sterling's face.
Oh, this...
Just a small team-building exercise, a bit of office humor, Sterling babbled, gesturing vaguely in my direction. Our little intern here was just learning a valuable lesson about corporate presentation. A lesson, Liam repeated, the words flat and devoid of emotion. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. A lesson in what? Exactly. Humiliation? Degradation? He walked past Sterling and came to stand directly in front of me. The entire room held its breath. Gently, he shrugged off his expensive suit jacket and draped it over my lap, covering the tear and shielding me from the prying eyes. He crouched down, so we were at eye level. Are you okay, Alara? He murmured, his voice now filled with a warmth that was meant only for me. I could only nod, my throat tight, with 1,000 unasked questions and a tidal wave of emotion. Liam stood up, turning to face a pale and trembling Mr. Sterling. My wife, Liam said, his voice ringing with cold, hard clarity, is the most intelligent, resilient, and dignified person I have ever known. She came to this company to learn and to contribute, not to be your punching bag. A collective gasp went through the room. Why? The word was whispered from person to person. A chain reaction of shock and dawning horror. Sterling's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of white. He looked from me to Liam and back again, his mind visibly failing to compute this impossible reality. I didn't know, sir. I had no idea, he sputtered. That's the point, Liam said, his voice dangerously soft. You shouldn't need to know who a person is married to in order to treat them with basic human decency. Your behavior wasn't just an attack on my wife, it was an attack on the culture of this company. A culture that, as of this moment, is under new management. He turned to the man who had entered with him, his head of security. David, please escort Mr. Sterling to his office. Have him pack his personal belongings. He is no longer an employee of this company. His access is revoked, effective immediately. But my contract, Sterling protested, his voice cracking. Consider it terminated for gross misconduct, Liam stated. His authority, absolute. You'll receive a box with your sad little desk plants in the mail. As David firmly took Sterling by the arm and led him, sputtering and defeated, from the room, Liam addressed the stunned audience. Let me be perfectly clear, he said, his voice resonating with power. The old way of doing things at Apex Innovations is over. The era of bullying, of looking down on people based on their background or what they wear, is finished. We will be a company built on merit, respect, and integrity. Anyone who has a problem with that can follow Mr. Sterling out the door. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of those who had been silent spectators to my torment. They withered under his stare, their expressions a mixture of fear and shame. Then, He turned back to me. He extended his hand. "Let's go home, Malira." I took his hand, and he gently pulled me to my feet. As we walked out of the conference room, leaving a trail of shattered careers and stunned silence behind us, I felt the weight of his jacket around my shoulders like a shield. Later that evening, in the quiet of our small apartment, the questions finally came. He explained everything: the company his family had built, his desire to keep his identity a secret when we first met, so he could be sure I loved him for who he was, and the recent acquisition of Apex, which he had planned to announce next week. He had wanted to observe the company culture from a distance before stepping in. He never imagined the toxicity was so concentrated or that I was at the center of it. "I am so sorry, Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held me close. "I should have told you. I never wanted you to go through that." I looked at him, at the man I loved, and saw not a billionaire CEO, but my Liam. "You didn't know?" I whispered. "But they do now." The next day, I walked back into Apex Innovations, not as an intern, but as Elara Vance, wife of the CEO. But more importantly, I walked in as myself. I wore another simple skirt, held my head high, and met the terrified, respectful gazes of my former colleagues. I had decided to stay, not to gloat, but to help Liam build the company he envisioned, where a person's worth was measured by the content of their character and the quality of their work, not the price tag on their clothes. The tearing of a skirt had been an attempt to shame me, but instead, it had unveiled a strength I never knew I had and a truth that would change everything.